I can still feel the weight of that August night pressing against my skin. The kind of heat that clings even after the sun disappears, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Most of the neighbors had already drifted home from the barbecue, leaving behind the ghost scents of charcoal and citronella, paper plates scattered across picnic tables like forgotten promises. Caleb stood beside me under the pale wash of the street lamp, close enough that I could catch the lingering smoke in his hair, the faint sweetness of beer on his breath. We had been friends since high school, though that word always felt insufficient when I said it out loud. Friends. As if the years between 17 and 32 could be summarized so simply. As if the careful distance we maintained was just coincidence. He was quieter than usual, his laughter softer now that the crowd had thinned. I watched him roll his sleeves up past his elbows, a gesture I had memorized without meaning to. The way his fingers worked the fabric. The way he always paused at the left sleeve, tugging it just a fraction higher. Small details that had no business matching, yet somehow anchored themselves in my memory. We were talking about nothing important. The weather, work, whether the Hendersons would ever fix their fence. The kind of conversation that fills space while something else waits underneath. I could feel it building between us, that familiar tension that had been growing stronger each time we found ourselves alone together. Then he turned toward me, and something shifted in his expression. His voice dropped low, almost reluctant, as he said that this had to stay between us. Just those words. This stays between us. And I knew, even before he took that half step closer, that whatever came next would change everything. The heat radiating from his body seemed to pull at something deep in my chest. Not desire, exactly, though that was there too. Something more fundamental. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of a truth I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten it had weight. I froze. Not from fear or discomfort, but from the sudden understanding that we were standing at the edge of something irreversible. All those years of careful friendship, of playing the role of Uncle Jules to his children, of pretending that the ache in my ribs when I watched him with Vanessa was just loneliness. All of it was about to crumble or crystallize, and I could not tell which would be worse. The street lamp hummed above us, casting everything in amber and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. The world felt suspended, waiting for one of us to speak or move or breathe too loudly and break whatever spell we had stumbled into. But we just stood there, close enough to touch, neither of us willing to cross that final inch of space that separated what we were from what we might become. And in that pause, in that moment of perfect, terrifying possibility, I understood that nothing would ever feel simple again. That night changed nothing and everything. The next morning, I woke in my own bed, alone, as I had for years. Coffee at 6:15. Shower at 6:30. The same route to the municipal planning office, past the same faded billboards advertising long-closed businesses, the same brick facades that had watched this town slowly exhale its youth. My life had always been measured in tidy routines. There was comfort in the predictability, I told myself. The zoning applications that crossed my desk, the subdivision plans that needed approval, the endless small decisions that shaped how people lived without them ever knowing my name. It provided stability, if not joy, purpose, if not passion. My townhouse sat on the edge of the city, where the sidewalks gave way to gravel and the streetlights grew sparse. Modest, the realtor had called it, which was generous. 2 bedrooms, though I had never needed the second. A kitchen with granite countertops that I had chosen because they seemed like what an adult would choose. Cookbooks lined the shelf above the stove, their spines still crisp and unbroken. Good intentions gathering dust. Evenings stretched long in that house. I would fold laundry and leave it stacked on the dresser for days. Order takeout and eat it standing at the kitchen counter. Check my phone more often than I cared to admit, hoping for a text from Caleb. Sometimes it came. Usually something mundane about work or the weather. But occasionally, late at night, he would send something more. A memory from high school. A question about nothing important. Just enough to remind me that I existed in his thoughts, even if only in the margins. He had married Vanessa 3 years after college. I was invited to the wedding, of course. sat in the third row and smiled through the ceremony, applauded at the reception, danced with his sister and his mother and everyone except the bride. The photographs from that day were beautiful. I looked happy in them, which surprised me. Their life together seemed effortless from the outside. Birthday parties in their backyard, with streamers tied to the oak tree and children shrieking with laughter as they chased each other around the swing set. Framed vacation photos on the mantel, the four of them squinting into the sun at various beaches and landmarks. The easy rhythm of belonging, of being part of something larger than yourself. I visited often, playing the role of Uncle Jules with practiced ease. I helped assemble Christmas toys and taught their son how to throw a baseball. I brought presents for birthdays and flowers for Vanessa when she had pneumonia. I carved pumpkins and attended school plays and pretended that the ache in my chest was just the normal longing that unmarried friends feel when they watch others build families. The children loved me, which made it easier and harder at the same time. Sophie, 5 years old, would climb into my lap during movie nights and fall asleep against my shoulder. Marcus, 7, would drag me outside to show me his latest drawings or the fort he had built from couch cushions. They saw me as part of their world, and I let them, even knowing that I would always be peripheral to it. Vanessa was kind to me in the way that secure people are kind to those they do not consider threats. She would ask about my dating life with genuine curiosity, suggest women she thought I might like, wonder aloud why such a nice man was still single. I learned to deflect these conversations with jokes and shrugs, to change the subject before the questions grew too pointed. But it was Caleb who made those visits both necessary and unbearable. The way he would light up when I arrived, as if my presence completed some picture he had been composing. The way he would save funny stories to tell me, or text me photos of things he thought I would appreciate. The way he would catch my eye across the dinner table and smile, and I would feel, for just a moment, like I was exactly where I belonged. Our town was the kind of place where everyone knew your business, but not necessarily your truth. A patchwork of old brick buildings and fading paint, with the river running through the center like a silver thread holding it all together. Main Street still had a hardware store and a diner, though the movie theater had closed and the department store had been empty for years. People stayed because they had always been there, or left because they could not imagine staying. There was rarely anything in between. I fell into the first category, though I sometimes wondered if inertia was the same thing as choice. My office window looked out over the town square, where the same elderly men gathered every morning to drink coffee and solve the world's problems. Where teenagers congregated after school, restless and loud, planning escapes I had never had the courage to attempt. At night, alone in my house, I would stand at the kitchen window and look across the dark shapes of rooftops toward the neighborhood where Caleb lived with his family. Sometimes I could see the glow of their porch light or the blue flicker of their television through the curtains. A life happening without me, as lives do. Beautiful, incomplete, and forever just out of reach. The call came on a Tuesday in early August, unremarkable in every way except for the timing. I was reviewing drainage plans for a new subdivision when my phone rang, Caleb's name lighting up the screen. He never called during work hours. Texts, occasionally, but never calls. Not unless something was wrong. His voice carried a tremor I had never heard before, carefully controlled but unmistakably there. He asked if he could come by later, alone, and the way he emphasized that last word made my stomach tighten. I said yes, of course, and spent the rest of the day unable to concentrate on anything except the clock on my computer screen moving too slowly toward 5. He arrived after dark, carrying a bottle of whiskey like an offering. Good whiskey, the kind we used to dream about affording when we were 22 and splitting gas money. He held it up with a weak smile and said he needed to get out of the house for a bit. Just for a bit. As if he were apologizing for something he had not yet done. We settled into my small living room, him on the couch, me in the chair across from him. The distance felt deliberate, though I could not say which of us had arranged it that way. He poured 2 glasses, neat, and we sat in the kind of silence that grows heavier with each passing moment. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. He talked about work first, the way people do when they need to warm up to something more difficult. Problems with a client, deadlines that seemed impossible, the general weight of responsibility. But even as he spoke, I could sense him circling around something larger, something he could not quite name. Then he shifted, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and admitted that he felt boxed in lately. Trapped, maybe. Like he was living someone else's life, even though it was a good life. A life that most people would envy. He kept apologizing for complaining, for not being grateful enough, for not knowing what was wrong with him when everything was so right. I listened without pressing, the way I had learned to listen to him over the years. Patient, careful not to push too hard or ask too many questions. He would tell me what he needed to tell me when he was ready. That was how it had always worked between us. The whiskey loosened something in both of us, though neither of us drank enough to call it drunk. Just enough to soften the edges, to make the words come easier. He talked about feeling like he was sleepwalking through his days, going through the motions of being a husband and father without really being present for any of it. He loved his family. He was quick to clarify. That was not the problem. The problem was something else, something he could not put into words. Then, without warning, he brought up the camping trip. The one from our senior year of high school, when his parents had let us borrow their tent and disappear into the state park for a long weekend. We had not spoken about it in detail since it happened, though I thought about it more often than I cared to admit. The way we had stayed up talking by the dying fire. The way he had fallen asleep next to me in the tent, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. The way I had lain awake for hours, memorizing the sound of his breathing. He mentioned it casually, as if it were just another memory, but his eyes found mine and held them a beat too long. Long enough for me to understand that he was thinking about the same moments I was. Long enough for the air in the room to shift, to become charged with something neither of us was ready to acknowledge. We finished our drinks in a different kind of silence after that. Heavier, but also more honest somehow. As if we had finally admitted that there were things between us that had never been spoken aloud. He left before midnight, thanking me for listening, for being someone he could talk to. When I closed the door behind him, I leaned against it for a long moment, trying to steady myself. The weeks that followed carried a new tension. Our text messages became more frequent, more carefully worded. When we saw each other at family gatherings or casual encounters around town, our conversations felt layered with meaning that had not been there before. Every casual touch, every shared glance, every moment of laughter felt weighted with possibility and danger. I found myself analyzing every interaction, searching for signs of what he might be thinking or feeling. The way he would find excuses to sit next to me at dinners. The way his hand would linger on my shoulder when he said goodbye. The way he would send me photos of things that reminded him of our high school days. Always late at night, when Vanessa would be asleep. Then came the night of the barbecue, the one I would replay in my mind for months afterward. The night when everything we had been circling around finally came close enough to touch. The night when he pulled me aside under the street lamp and said that this had to stay between us, and I understood that we were no longer just friends carrying unspoken feelings. We were something else now, something more dangerous and more real, something that would change everything, whether we wanted it to or not. After that night under the street lamp, the world rearranged itself in subtle ways. Colors seemed sharper, sounds carried further. The distance between my house and his felt both infinite and impossibly small. I began to notice things I had trained myself to overlook for years, as if that moment of recognition had switched on some part of my brain that had been deliberately dimmed. The changes started small. Text messages that arrived after 11 at night, when his family would be asleep. Nothing inappropriate, nothing that could not be explained away if Vanessa happened to see them. Just fragments of thoughts, observations about the day, questions that seemed to have no real purpose except to maintain a connection between us. I would stare at my phone in the dark, crafting responses that struck the right balance of friendly and careful, never quite saying what I wanted to say. Our conversations began to linger in ways they never had before. Phone calls about practical things, helping him research a new lawn mower or discussing weekend plans, would stretch into discussions about nothing in particular. The quality of light in the evening. A song that had been stuck in his head. The way the town looked different from the bridge over the river. Surface-level observations that felt loaded with meaning I was afraid to examine too closely. When we were together in person, I became hyper-aware of the space between our bodies. The way he would choose to sit next to me on the couch during family movie nights, close enough that our knees would touch when one of us shifted position. The way he would lean closer than necessary when showing me something on his phone, or how his hand would rest on my shoulder a fraction longer than casual friendship required. 3 weeks after the barbecue, he called me on a Saturday morning with an unusual request. Vanessa needed a few things from the stores on the other side of town, he said, and wondered if I wanted to ride along. Keep him company. It was thin pretense, and we both knew it. She could have given him a list. He could have gone alone. But I said yes anyway, and an hour later we were driving through the countryside with the windows down and no particular urgency to reach our destination. We talked about safe things at first. Work, the weather, whether the Hendersons had finally decided to replace their broken fence. But as the miles passed, the conversation grew more personal. He mentioned feeling restless lately, like he was missing something important but could not identify what. There was a longing in his voice that I recognized because it lived in my chest too, unnamed and persistent. We stopped at an overlook by the river, ostensibly to check his phone for Vanessa's shopping list, but neither of us made any move to continue toward town. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the water in shades of gold and amber. We stood side by side against the metal railing, not quite touching but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. He talked about feeling like he was living his life at a distance, watching himself go through the motions without really being present for any of it. Good motions, he was careful to clarify. A good job, a good marriage, good children. But somehow he felt like he was missing the point of it all, like there was some essential piece of himself that he had misplaced somewhere along the way. I listened, sensing an invitation in the spaces between his words, but not knowing how to respond. Fear kept me silent. Fear of misreading the situation, of saying too much, of crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. We had spent so many years building a careful friendship around the edges of something larger. I was terrified of being the one to destroy that delicate balance. The drive home was quieter, charged with everything we had not said. When he dropped me off at my house, he lingered in the driveway for a moment longer than necessary, as if he wanted to add something more to the conversation. But in the end, he just thanked me for coming along and said he would see me soon. The nights grew longer after that, punctuated by moments that felt like near confessions. He would show up at my door with takeout and a movie, or suggest we grab a drink at the bar on the edge of town where we were unlikely to encounter anyone we knew. These evenings had a different quality than our previous casual hangouts. More intentional, more weighted with possibility. During one of these nights, after we had shared more drinks than either of us usually allowed ourselves, something shifted. We were sitting on my couch, some forgettable movie playing on the television, when he began talking about the camping trip again. This time he was more specific, more honest about what he remembered. The way we had stayed up talking until dawn. The way the conversations had felt different from anything we shared with other friends. The way he had woken up the next morning with his arm draped across my chest and had not moved it immediately, had let himself enjoy the warmth and closeness for a few stolen moments before the day required him to pull away. As he spoke, I felt the careful walls we had built around our friendship beginning to crumble. The fear was still there, but it was competing now with something stronger. Hope, maybe, or recognition. The understanding that I was not alone in carrying these feelings, that they had been growing in him too, patient and persistent as roots finding their way through concrete. Near the end of the evening, as we were discussing whether he was sober enough to drive home, his hand found mine on the arm of the couch. It was such a brief contact that I almost convinced myself it was accidental. Just a casual touch, the kind that happens between friends all the time. Except he did not pull away immediately. Instead, his fingers lingered against mine for several heartbeats, warm and slightly trembling. And in that pause I felt the unspoken truth between us growing too large to ignore. When he finally moved his hand, the air in the room felt different. Thinner. more dangerous. We did not talk about it, but we did not need to. Something fundamental had shifted, and we both understood that there was no going back to the careful distance we had maintained for so many years. He stayed on my couch that night, claiming he was too tired to drive safely. I brought him a pillow and blanket, and when our fingers brushed during the exchange, neither of us pretended it was accidental. We were beyond pretending now, standing at the edge of something that would change everything, whether we found the courage to step forward or not. The storm arrived on a Thursday night in late August, one of those Midwestern tempests that builds slowly through the day before unleashing itself with biblical fury. I had been watching the sky darken from my kitchen window, the air growing thick and electric with the promise of rain. By 9 o'clock, the first drops were spattering against the glass, and by 10, the wind was howling through the trees with enough force to rattle the windows. I was settling in for the evening, resigned to losing power and spending the night by candlelight, when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Caleb standing on my porch, soaked to the bone despite the short run from his car. His hair was plastered to his head, and his shirt clung to his body in a way that made me look away quickly before opening the door. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, water dripping from his clothes onto my hardwood floor. I grabbed a towel from the linen closet and handed it to him, trying not to stare as he rubbed it through his hair. When I asked what he was doing out in weather like this, he said he had needed to be somewhere else. Just somewhere else. The way he said it made it clear that the storm was not the only thing driving him out into the night. I made coffee while he changed into a spare shirt I found in my closet, one that hung loosely on his frame but was dry and warm. We settled into the living room as the storm raged outside, the thunder rolling overhead in waves that seemed to shake the foundation of the house. The power flickered twice but held, casting us in the warm glow of the table lamps while the world outside disappeared behind sheets of rain. We talked about inconsequential things at first, the way people do when they are working up the courage to address something more significant. The storm, work, whether the creek behind his house would flood again this year. But as the hours passed and the coffee grew cold, the conversation began to take on a different quality. More halting, more honest. He told me about lying awake the night before, staring at the ceiling while Vanessa slept beside him. About feeling like he was living a double life, though he could not explain what he meant by that. About moments when he would catch himself thinking about things he had no business thinking about. People he had no business thinking about in ways that made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. I listened without interrupting, sensing that he was building towards something important. The thunder provided a soundtrack to his confession, punctuating his words with cosmic emphasis. Lightning flashed outside the windows, illuminating his face in stark black and white before plunging us back into the warm amber of the lamps. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it over the storm, he admitted that he had been thinking about crossing a line with me for years. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to take back or ignore. He followed the confession quickly with a clarification, almost a denial. He was not like that, he said. He had never been like that. He did not understand what was happening to him or why these thoughts would not leave him alone. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I had been carrying the same thoughts for just as long. But the words stuck in my throat, caught between fear and hope and the terrible vulnerability of being seen so completely. Instead, I simply sat there, watching him struggle with the weight of what he had just revealed. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder moving slowly across the sky. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been the reflection of the lightning outside. He leaned forward then, slowly, as if testing the air between us for resistance. I did not move away, could not move away. When his forehead came to rest against mine, I could feel his breath against my lips, warm and unsteady. We stayed like that for a long moment, sharing the same air, the same space, the same terrifying possibility. The kiss, when it came, was tentative, almost accidental, a question more than a statement. but it shattered something inside me that had been holding back a dam of feelings for so many years that I had forgotten they were there. When his lips touched mine, everything I had been carefully controlling came rushing forward at once. Want and longing and the desperate relief of finally being allowed to feel what I had been feeling all along. Neither of us said the word love, but it was there in the way our hands found each other and held on. It was there in the way we pulled apart and came together again, as if testing whether this was real or just another dream that would evaporate with the morning light. It was there in the careful way we explored this new territory between us, afraid of moving too fast or pushing too hard or breaking whatever fragile thing we had just created. We talked until the storm began to fade, our voices growing softer as the thunder moved into the distance and the rain gentled to a steady patter against the roof. We talked about fear and confusion and the impossibility of the situation we had found ourselves in. We talked about what this meant and what it could never mean, about the life he had built and the life I had been living on the periphery of his. When the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the windows, reality started to creep back in around the edges of our perfect, impossible night. He would have to go home soon, back to his family, his responsibilities, his normal life. But for now, in the quiet after the storm, we allowed ourselves to exist in this space we had carved out between what was and what could never be. The ache of his leaving was already building in my chest, even as he sat beside me on the couch, his hands still warm in mine. Because now I knew what it felt like to have him, and I understood that made losing him again infinitely worse. The days that followed the storm were heavy with unspoken decisions. I would wake each morning expecting to feel different, changed somehow by what had happened between us. Instead, I felt suspended, caught between the memory of his mouth on mine and the uncertainty of what came next. The kiss had answered one question and created a dozen others, all of them more complicated than the last. Caleb seemed to be wrestling with the same impossible equation. He would disappear for days, ignoring my texts, avoiding the places where we might accidentally encounter each other. Then, without warning, he would show up at my door with coffee and an apology, staying for hours as if trying to make up for lost time. The pattern was exhausting and heartbreaking. This push and pull of someone trying to exist in two worlds without fully committing to either. During his absent periods, I would catch glimpses of him around town, always with his family. At the grocery store, pushing a cart while Sophie rode in the front and Marcus darted between the aisles. At the park, teaching his son to ride a bike, while Vanessa watched from a picnic blanket. These moments felt like looking through glass at a life I could never be part of, beautiful and complete without me. When he was present, when he would arrive at my house with that careful smile and those eyes that said everything his mouth would not, I could almost forget about the impossibility of our situation. We would sit on my couch, ostensibly watching television, but really just existing in the same space, hyper-aware of every casual touch and shared glance. The air between us felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. The guilt was worst when his phone would ring during these visits. Vanessa checking on his whereabouts, asking when he would be home, reminding him about dinner plans or school events. I would watch his face change during these conversations, see him transform back into the husband and father he was supposed to be. The ease with which he could slip into that role made me understand how practiced he had become at compartmentalizing his life. After he would hang up, we would sit in the kind of silence that grows heavier with each passing moment. Neither of us knowing how to acknowledge what was happening, neither of us willing to pretend it was not. He would leave shortly after these calls, always with the same apologetic expression, always promising to call or text soon. I would watch him drive away and wonder if this was what loving someone was supposed to feel like, this constant ache of having and not having simultaneously. 3 weeks into this exhausting dance, he called me on a Sunday afternoon. His voice was different, more determined than I had heard it in days. He asked if I wanted to go for a drive, just the two of us. No errands this time, no pretense about needing company for practical purposes. Just a drive. We ended up at the same overlook where we had stopped weeks earlier, the place where he had first admitted to feeling like something was missing from his life. The river stretched out below us, moving slow and dark in the afternoon light. We stood against the railing in silence for several minutes, both of us understanding that this conversation would be different from the others. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but tired. He said he could not continue living in this limbo, this space between what was and what might be. Something had to change, he said. He could not keep disappearing for days and then showing up at my door, could not keep having one foot in his real life and one foot in whatever this was between us. It was not fair to anyone, least of all to me. I listened, knowing that this was the conversation I had been both hoping for and dreading. The one where we would finally acknowledge that what had started as friendship had become something else entirely, something that could not coexist with the life he had built. But then he admitted that he was terrified of what change would mean, terrified of hurting his family, of destroying everything he had worked to create, of discovering that he was not the man he had always believed himself to be. The fear in his voice was palpable, the sound of someone standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing how far the fall might be. I found my voice then, telling him quietly that I was tired of being a secret, tired of existing in the margins of his life, of pretending that what we felt for each other was just friendship, of watching him struggle to balance two different versions of himself. The words came out more calmly than I felt, but they carried the weight of years of careful silence. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he stared out at the water, his hands gripping the railing so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. I could see him working through the implications of what I had said, understanding that this was not just about the two of us anymore, but about the larger question of who he was and what kind of life he wanted to live. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of wind through the trees and the distant murmur of the river below. A car passed on the road behind us, its engine fading into the distance, leaving us alone again with the weight of everything we had said and everything we had not said. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. He said he did not know if he was strong enough to leave, strong enough to stay, strong enough to choose one life over another. The honesty in his admission was devastating and beautiful at the same time. I wanted to tell him that strength was not about choosing the easiest path, that love required courage more than certainty. But I could see in his face that he already knew these things. The question was not what he should do, but whether he could find the courage to do it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in early October, 3 weeks after our conversation by the river. 3 weeks of silence that had stretched between us like a held breath, growing more difficult to bear with each passing day. I found it slipped under my door when I came home from work, my name written across the envelope in Caleb's careful handwriting. No return address, no postmark, just my name and the weight of whatever lay inside. I carried it to the kitchen table and stared at it for several minutes before finding the courage to open it. Inside was no explanation, no lengthy confession or apology. Just a single Polaroid photograph and 7 words written on a piece of paper torn from a notebook. The photograph was from our camping trip senior year, the one we had referenced so many times in recent months, but never fully examined. We looked impossibly young in the faded image, sitting by a campfire with the kind of easy closeness that I had forgotten we once shared so openly. Caleb's arm was draped across my shoulders, both of us grinning at whoever had taken the picture. Probably someone from our group who had wandered over from their own campsite, wanting to document the moment for posterity. Looking at it now, I could see what I had been too young to recognize then. The way Caleb's fingers rested on my shoulder, casual but possessive. The way I leaned into him, my body turned slightly toward his even as we both faced the camera. The way we looked like two people who belonged together, who had found something in each other that they could not find anywhere else. The words on the paper were simple and devastating in their honesty. You have always been more to me than I could admit. Present tense, not past. Not a goodbye, exactly, but an acknowledgement of something that would remain true regardless of the choices he had made or would make in the future. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, holding the photograph and reading those 7 words over and over until they were burned into my memory. Outside, the first autumn leaves were beginning to fall, drifting past the window in lazy spirals. The world was changing seasons, moving forward with the relentless momentum that time demands. But in my kitchen, surrounded by the quiet of my empty house, I felt suspended in this moment of recognition and loss. Eventually, I walked to the living room and retrieved the book from my shelf where I had hidden our high school graduation photo years ago. A collection of poetry that I had never actually read, chosen specifically because it looked intellectual and unthreatening sitting among my other books. I slipped the Polaroid between the pages, next to the formal photograph of us in our caps and gowns, and returned the book to its place. 2 different versions of the same truth, separated by more than a decade but connected by the thread of feeling that had never really disappeared. Evidence of something that had been real, even if it could never be acted upon, even if it would remain forever in the margins of the life he had chosen to live. I picked up my phone from the coffee table, where it had been sitting face up all evening, waiting for a call or text that would never come. I turned it over and set it down again, screen against the wood. Whatever needed to be said had been said. Whatever needed to be understood, I understood. Moving to the window, I opened it despite the cool evening air. The sound of wind through the trees filled the room, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear children playing in their backyards, their voices bright with the kind of joy that comes before you understand how complicated life can become. In the fading light, I let myself remember the feel of Caleb's forehead against mine during the storm, the weight of his hand in mine, the way his voice had sounded when he admitted he had been thinking about crossing a line for years. These memories would have to be enough now, preserved like pressed flowers between the pages of my heart. The story did not end with resolution or reunion. It ended with the knowledge that some truths, once spoken, change everything even when they change nothing. It ended with the understanding that love does not always mean possession, that caring for someone sometimes means letting them make choices that break your heart. As the darkness settled around my house and the autumn air moved through the open window, I breathed in the quiet and found, surprisingly, that it was enough.